Independent horror projects have been a staple in the online stratosphere for as long as the internet has been accessible. Undoubtedly, the most popular subgenre of independent horror to be uploaded online would be found footage. There are many reasons for this, usually boiling down to the fact that they are easy to make. Usually only needing a camcorder and, if you wanted to be a little bit more fancy, some knowledge in audio engineering. Most of the time, these videos would be uploaded as short one-off videos, but would really get popularized by things such as the web series Marble Hornets, a found footage series meant to expand the, at the time, only growing Slenderman mythos. Over the years, you would see found footage horror come and go, most of it being heavily inspired by the pioneer of the genre, the Blair Witch Project, a movie made in the early days of the internet that would bring the genre into the mainstream. But since, found footage horror started to feel a bit stale. There wasn't much that people could really seem to do with the medium anymore, and it started to diminish, but not entirely.
I am a McMeat.
Analog horror is a subgenre of found footage. It's defined by setting up various emergency alert system scenarios, which mainly rely on audio as opposed to visuals. Now, I personally believe this definition to be very dated, considering that more modern analog horrors definitely rely on their visuals just as much, if not even more than their audio. CHSS is credited as the first stream of videos in this subgenre, to then be popularized by the other series, Local 58. It's a subgenre that has expanded in an incredibly short amount of time to one of the most popular forms of independent content creation on YouTube. The medium only growing with every new video series to come out. But as time went on, there started to be a very noticeable portion of people talking about how they became tired of the subgenre, ironically becoming as, or even more oversaturated than the found footage formula it overthrew. It's very interesting, because you can make the argument that the subgenre of analog horror hasn't even anywhere reached the heights of found footage, and yet it's already burnt out for a lot of people. It makes me want to conclude some questions I have regarding the subgenre for quite some time now. Why has the genre not innovated that much? Or has it? How did it get so popular? How has it still retained a core audience despite its repetition? And most importantly, what is the future of analog horror? But to get these answers about its future, we have to look at its roots and origins first. Back in 2016 to 2018, analog horror was a much more niche and primitive subgenre compared to what it is today, only occasionally getting an explained video by popular horror or mystery channels alike that would somewhat boost their popularity. The term analog horror wasn't really something that was even coined until more recently. Looking back at old videos talking about something like Local 58 for instance, you can see that people referred to the subgenre more as ARGs or horror web series. Once again, going to show how young the genre was. It is kind of hard to pinpoint the first analog horror series. There were programs such as Crania Grisborough TV, dating all the way back to 2013 that can be considered analog horror. Honestly though, I feel like there's a distinction between something like Crania Grisborough and a more modern analog horror like Local 58. I consider tapes like these more in the genre of VHS found footage than analog horror, although still a very important roadmap to analog horror and one that will definitely be utilized more in the future of analog horror as well. We're not quite there yet. As mentioned earlier, something more like CHSS is credited as being the very first true analog horror series. It set the trend of an ARG-like scenario combined with the aesthetic of analog television. CHSS also introduced another very prominent key component that makes analog horror, as well as its found footage predecessors, unfiction, the secret recipe to all the stories in this genre. The premise of unfiction is very simple. It means that the piece of fiction being broadcasted online or even theatrically may try to present itself as if it were something that actually happened in reality. It's why when you go into the description of an analog horror, you may see a narration from the perspective of a person who just found the tapes and decided to post them online. It's the same reasoning of the Blair Witch Project and why it fooled so many people, or even something that takes this concept a lot more personally, such as Petscop. It's around the time of 2017 that modern analog horror and its tropes finally started to get solidified, with the introduction of the most important series to date. Local 58's debut not only brought the genre to great heights, being the pioneer in most people's eyes, but also really took the formula of found footage that we were previously used to and flipped it on its head. Instead of a group of friends exploring a creepy forest or some surrealist art piece that the internet would attach a story to, these pieces of unfiction would present themselves as if they were once broadcasted to everyone, only becoming lost with the passage of time. Just think to yourself, who archives every time their local station has aired something? Every news broadcast, every commercial, every missing persons report, especially during the time where internet access wasn't readily available, and you either had to rely on just catching a program or maybe a little down the line saving it with a VCR. Analog horror is special for that exact reason. They're not meant to be tapes found in the deep woods or in an abandoned building. It's supposed to be programming that just went completely under our noses. With Local 58, we are seeing broadcasts related to a creature on the moon that is causing abnormalities to happen back on Earth. Seemingly, these anomalies are completely out of view of the general public. This kind of story setup is going to be very important when discussing more tapes in the future, as the setup would follow with many other projects going forward. Something I see Local 58 be praised for as opposed to other analog horror is that not only does it not rely on jump scares, but it also has very minimal full frontal disturbing imagery. If you don't know what I mean by that just now, you will start to as it becomes heavily synonymous with the genre. Instead, Local 58 introduced more subtle tropes to the medium, such as a reliance on text and audio, much like the old definition of analog horror stated. Local 58 is bar none the most important cornerstone to the foundations of modern analog horror. Everything that would come after would borrow from its formula in multiple ways. It even fleshed out the idea of a broadcasting company drip-feeding something sinister that is happening behind the scenes, something different videos would replicate and add to. Although Local 58 was starting to get popular, it wasn't considered something that kickstarted a genre just yet. There would be a lot more things to come that would also add to the growing themes and popularity. I was going to plan on using this to transition to talking about Gemini Home Entertainment, a web series that takes some of the things that were defined in Local 58 and innovates on them with new tropes synonymous of analog horror. But we're gonna have to take a detour, as around the same time of 2019, one of the most important advancements in analog horror would brace us. On July 25th, 2019, YouTuber and animator Squimpus McGrimpus would upload a video that would not only start a long-running series of its own, but a complete refresh for the Five Nights at Freddy's community. FNAF VHS is such a big niche of analog horror that you can label it in its own subgenre. These tapes, obviously depicting Fazbear Entertainment or original animatronic manufacturing companies, really just any restaurant that also has entertainment mascots involved can be a part of this subgenre. As we will see, you can still have it be original characters to still fall into this niche of analog horror. FNAF VHS popularized a lot more tropes of the medium outside of just being FNAF related too. It gave way to expanding the setups outside of just local broadcasting stations, to things like company training tapes too. Outside of that, the much more human and less cosmic nature of FNAF birthed something that would become synonymous with this genre up until this point as well. These contorted, warped faces still get to me occasionally. I know these photos have basically turned into laughingstocks to many people now, but when I first saw these, and still when I see them in the right context, they can still absolutely frighten me. I still remember watching the facial recognition testing video for the first time and seeing the William Afton payoff right at the end. It was the most scared I have been of anything FNAF related for the last 4 years up until that point. Has that feeling started to wane as time went on? Sure. Being exposed to the same type of horror all the time will inevitably tire you out, even if it's executed incredibly well. You've seen it happen 5 years prior with the first Five Nights at Freddy's. The game that was acclaimed to be the scariest game ever by many started to become something that barely phases one in later entries.
Oh shit.
It's the same evolution I feel we've seen when it comes to what I can only label as the analog horror face. FNAF VHS would go on to spawn several videos inspired from it. Some being good, and others... Well, I'm not gonna make fun of someone's amateur animation skills, but some of these videos certainly did contribute to ruining the credibility of this niche for a lot of people. Squimpus's tapes may have introduced more tropes to the medium, even outside of FNAF, but there would be 2 other series that would not only change the climate of analog horror, but once again, blow it up to new, disproportionate heights. Let's go in order. The Walten Files is a very peculiar set of videos, starting off as something obviously very FNAF inspired and obviously continuing to be, but would go on to become so distinct from what we are used to with FNAF related media, as well as other analog horror up to this point. The archival feel of analog footage makes it a great vessel for cosmic setups such as Local 58 or Gemini, but as we discussed earlier, FNAF is obviously not reliant on cosmic horror. Unless you count this. But with that knowledge, it means that the Walten Files has the potential to be an incredibly human story expressed through this medium, shining light on the aspects of FNAF lore that would never be touched in the main continuity, such as fleshing out the main antagonists and genuinely making you feel their tragedy and how their actions have affected those around them. Even somewhat being able to make them feel sympathetic. It's honestly something not really explored much in any other stories in this group. Everyone is so focused on the big scary monster most of the time that no one really questions how it got there or how it's been affecting other people. Now these stories are definitely starting to change in that direction, which I'm really appreciating, as it may lead to more innovation with the whole medium and bring more variety to the type of content under these types of videos. Around this time though, you did start to see a lot of people start criticizing the repetition of analog horror, mainly the tropes of something seemingly normal turning into something sinister after 5 minutes of a face showing up. It's a fun novelty that I personally do enjoy if it's executed properly, but yeah, I can personally say that I'm kinda tired of this formula too. And I think I can pinpoint just exactly where the final straw was for a lot of people. Now don't get it twisted, I love the Mandela Catalog. It's probably my favorite out of all of the videos we have talked about up until this point. It is also statistically the most popular series going on currently, so it certainly has an audience too. But I can't shake the feeling that this series may have contributed as the final nail in the coffin to so many people. The most iconic thing about these videos, their faces, are very hit or miss in the first episode. That's something that I believe the creator even agrees with. Volume 1 has scenes in it that genuinely made me scared to turn off my lights when going to bed, and other scenes that have made me audibly laugh. The consistency certainly gets better in later installments, but with Volume 1 being twice as popular as everything else to come after it, there's plenty of people who won't even know about the series' improvements. And Alex has posted a very interesting set of paragraphs a few weeks ago regarding it, stating it's going to be nothing like what has come before, and that he is tired of the analog horror tropes he is so tied to. It's a very interesting development, because it's not even one that's exclusive to Alex anymore. Year, Local 58 uploaded its newest video, announcing the newest advancement in its plot, and, along with it, letting go of their analog aesthetic. Local 58's digital transmission video is in a lot of ways like Alex's post he made a few weeks back. The purpose of this video is very clear. It's meant to start distancing away the videos from just relying on analog television to carry its visuals. And although it's very fair to like the tropes analog horror has introduced, I personally still really like them. I can certainly understand how limiting creatively it must feel to stick with that genre with how oversaturated it has been getting. For the case of Local 58, I think the switch will be slower, as we still end the video off from the perspective of an analog television. But I do believe that the future of the series won't be what it started off as. Neither will the Walten Files or the Mandela Catalog or any other popular analog horror to surface in the future. But with that being said, what even is the future of analog horror? It's been the focal point of this entire video, but we've been heavily talking about how we've got here, instead of actually talking about the key subject. Is the future of the medium to just be forgotten about and eventually die off from the general consciousness? Or will it continue to evolve in new ways like we are currently seeing? I think I'm gonna need to get somebody. I can confidently say that the genre of analog horror is getting really stale really quick, which is unfortunately kind of my fault. In fact, I physically cannot go back and watch the first few videos without cringing incredibly hard at the amateurish technical issues. I never expected those flawed videos to get millions and millions of views, and honestly, I wish they never did. I get blamed often for being the reason why analog horror has gotten really repetitive and cliche in the recent months, and I am not afraid to admit that it's probably true. Analog horror is a really fun genre, especially as someone who is a huge fan of found footage, but there comes to to a point where someone needs to do something different with it. I'm not trying to sound like I will be that person, but the Mandela Catalog Volume 3 is going to include some of the most left-field stuff I have made so far. I don't think that analog horror needs to be so limited with its approach to storytelling, especially when it comes to authenticity. Sure, the first few big analog horror series strive for authenticity and realism, which I respect greatly, but in my opinion, that limits the creative potential of so many series, including my own, which is why I'm going for a more surrealist vibe with my next Mandela Catalog. A lot of things aren't going to make sense when it comes to the medium of storytelling, but I think that is okay. Barriers need to finally be broken, and I pride myself on doing that in a genre that is getting stagnant. These were words spoken by Mandela Catalog creator Alex Kister. I personally asked him about the current state of analog horror. I asked him more questions, which we will get to, but this opener is the first one I really want to highlight. Alex is obviously a very important creator in this niche of content, and I personally believe his insight here is incredibly important. Many people personally do believe that analog horror was a genre dead on arrival, something that shouldn't be innovated on or expanded upon outside its peak. It can be seen as a novelty expansion of found footage, but it's understandable to see why many people don't see it as anything more than that. If you were to show a casual viewer an episode of Local 58 and an episode of Gemini, they may believe they were a part of the same series. Yes, they are obviously both very different in many departments, especially visuals, but the biggest criticism between many of these series attempting to be authentic, as Alex puts it, is that they do start to feel like they are all the same. When I asked Alex about the evolution of analog horror over time and whether the genre can innovate even further, this was my response. I absolutely believe there can be innovation with the way analog horror storytelling is presented. In my opinion, the Walten Files is a series that emphasized the visual aspect of storytelling way more than its peers, which is a series I really look up to. As a result, I believe that analog horror has recently had that change from an emphasis on audio to an emphasis on visuals. Relying on audio only goes so far, especially when it develops a lot of tropes, but it is still crucial to crafting a great analog horror video. With the mention Alex makes of Bunny Farm and its visuals in this paragraph, it does go to show that, although yes, these modern analog horror videos may still be incredibly tropey, but they do ultimately have immense talent and care put into them. They may be remembered just for their faces or some other disturbing scenes, but then you have to stop and think that someone also had to sit down and make all of this sprite work, artwork, and direct voice acting for a project like this. The Walten Files Tape 3, if anything, is more similar to Petscop in its aesthetics than something like Local 58. Both can be put into the same blanket term of analog horror, but both are still so incredibly unique in their own ways that they can be classified into two completely separate things if you want to categorize. I mean, FNAF VHS has its own category of analog horror. Why don't we expand that to haunted games too? The last thing I asked him about is the current disassociation between analog horror creators and their roots, and what Alex's advice would be for any up-and-coming analog horror creators. This is the response that I got. Story comes first. Audio and visuals certainly also matter, but even the most technically impressive series could fall from having poor storytelling. If you include inspirations from other series, try to implement something of your own into it. Who knows, maybe you'll accidentally come up with a completely original idea of your own in the process, which has definitely happened to me a few times. Overall, I would recommend trying to deviate from the norm. Throw in some curveballs. Something that I sometimes suffer from is trying to please the audience. But I have come to the realization that the Mandela Catalog is my series and I want it to be personal to me. I recommend following a similar thought pattern to any other aspiring creators of any kind. So, analog horror. A genre that has had many ups and downs since its early inception. One that has had an evolution of genuinely great concepts to seemingly overplayed tropes. Does it have a future? I think yes. There are certain aspects of analog horror that I think are starting to run its course. A broadcasting station showing off some cosmic entity has been done by several popular series now, with most of them still ongoing. I think just like Alex said, it's time for people to rely less on the authenticity and realism of analog broadcasting, but rather use it as a vessel to carry your storytelling and imagery in a way that you want to represent it. Something like the Walten Files has moments where you can directly see that the creatures in the tapes are personally trying to contact the one on the other side. This is a far cry from what something like Local 58 has done, and it's obviously benefited from it. Focusing on what you personally want to do to make it more creative and engaging should come first. Local 58 wasn't trying to be the next CHSS, the Walten Files wasn't trying to be the next FNAF VHS, the Mandela Catalog wasn't trying to be the next Walten Files. All of these videos may take inspiration from one another, but they all have their own things that make them set aside from their peers. Something that these smaller videos I feel are failing to notice. Analog horror only has a future as long as people can continue to be as creative as the pillars in the genre. If we keep innovating, we can surely have this subgenre stick around for much longer than some people may expect. But other than that, I've said everything I want to about this topic. I've been Dags, and until next time, see ya.